Hello everybody and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex and today I've got an Ikoria draft guide for us. Ikoria is coming back to Arena this week. I always love episodes where I get to talk about these older draft formats, especially one like Ikoria where I consider it one of my favorites of the past 5 years or so. I do think it's one of the greats personally. It's definitely a polarizing format and we'll get into why. But the people who love the format love it, and I'm one of those people, so let's jump right in. Alright, so before we get into any archetypes or individual cards or anything like that, just wanted to give a bit of a background about the set for people who haven't played it before, or maybe, it's been 4 or 5 years at this point, so people who want a little bit of a refresher just to set the stage for what we're in for. As always, when is the case, I have to give a shout out to the set being a Dave set. That is a set where Dave Humphries was the lead designer. He's got a fantastic track record as far as sets he's worked on, stuff like Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, Call Time, and of course, most recently, Thunder Junction. So him and his teams have just done fantastic jobs on a lot of sets in recent years, and often there are some similarities between the sets, things that he really likes to implement in his limited formats, and two that really come to mind for me that are definitely true in Ikoria and all the sets that I just talked about. Number one, good fixing. So we've got stuff like Evolving Wilds at common. We've got a cycle of rare dual lands, the triomes, the ones that tap for 1 or 3 colors and cycle for 3 mana. And we've got the cycle of the gain lands. So the dual lands that come in, they gain a life. So just like you might be familiar with Thunder Junction, if you want fixing, it's there. You gotta take it when you see it if you want it, because other people are gonna want it too. But it definitely just gives you a lot of flexibility in the draft, allows you to splash things, allows you to dip into other colors for interesting synergies, which I think is generally a good thing. I tend to like sets of dual lands at common. I think there's a such thing as too much fixing, but I don't think Ikoria crosses that boundary. Something interesting color-wise about the set, and just like the way that the set is set up, is it's sort of a weird mix between a 2-color set and a 3-color set. It's not quite as far off the deep end of a 3-color set like something like Konzatar here, Streets of New Capenna, Shards of Alara, but it also isn't quite a 2-color set. So what I mean by that is it's got a lot of the kind of infrastructure you would see in a 3-color set. For example, like you see in most 3-color sets, there's more of a focus on 5 of the color pairs and less of a focus on the other 5. If you played Streets of New Capenna, there was a thing where it's like, well, you didn't really want to start in black-white, because then you could only be in Obscura and black-white-blue. Instead, you wanted to start in white-blue, for example, because then you could be 2 out of the 5 families. Same kind of thing here, where the allied color pairs, so like red-white, black-white, blue-green, those are more supported than the allied ones. There's also 3-colored rares you're gonna see. So there's like a cycle of ultimatums, like Cruel Ultimatum, but it's the enemy ones, the wedge ones. So there's like Inspired Ultimatum, which costs blue, blue, red, 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 white, white. There's also just like a bunch of normal 3-color rares as well, but it doesn't go as deep, like I mentioned. Like there aren't any 3-color commons, for example. There aren't any 3-color uncommons, and I think most of the time, if you want to figure out like how often am I gonna be 2 colors versus 3. I think it's actually kind of like Thunder Junction, where if your lane is quite open, you're just going to be 2 colors. It's fine. But maybe if your lane isn't that open, there's not 2 colors that are really sticking out, you're going to dip into a 3rd color for some power, you're going to dip into a 3rd color maybe for some removal. I guess the way I would think about it is 2 colors is most often the default, and most often it's going to be your enemy 2 colors, right? Not the allied ones. But if you open up a rare that makes you want to be 3 colors, or maybe you're just like in a seat that sees a lot of fixing, yeah, you can definitely be closer to 2 colors in a splash, or closer to even a little bit more heavy 3 colors. Just a weird dynamic that not a lot of sets are like this. And like I said, I think OTJ actually might be the closest comparison. Second thing I think of when I think of these Dave sets, and this is definitely true for Ikoria, is kind of flexibility of your archetype, or flexibility of what your deck's doing, not being super restricted just by your color pair. Like, there's some formats, I think maybe Phyrexia will be one that comes to mind, where it's like, well, if you're white-black, you're exactly white-black toxic, you can't really do that much else. But again, to go back to OTJ, you could be a green-white mount deck if you get all the focus pieces of that. You get the Miriams, you get the good mounts, but you can also be like a green-white slower deck, a little bit more rampy, a little more splashy. You're just using the green ramp cards, maybe some white removal. Black-white, probably another good example of this from Thunder Junction, where I've had some very controlling black-white decks where they're like, going in on Bandit's Hall and a million pieces of removal. But then other ones where it's like, yeah, I'm just playing Trained Airings on turn 2 and going to town. So when you're playing Ikoria, it's a lot of the same thing. You really want to think about, what is my deck doing? A little bit less, what is my color pair supposed to do? And, that's going to be, once again, the default. If you're red-white, for example, you're most likely going to be the red-white cycling deck, which is the big bad of the format. I'm sure even if you haven't played this format before, you might have heard of how good red-white cycling was in this format. And you're going to be that most of the time when you find yourself in these colors. But I've had, like, go wide red-white mutate decks work out in the past playing this format. Or when you're playing red-black, for example, which is actually one of the better allied color pairs in the set, you could be a steal and sack deck, or you could be a little more of a deck that cares about things that have menace. There's cards that care about keywords in this set. So definitely, you know, as I talk about these cards, as I talk about these archetypes, take in what the archetypes are doing, what they're supposed to do, but don't think you're locked in. Look for synergies based on what your cards are and what your best cards are doing, not just necessarily strictly like, well, I've got to be this exact thing if I'm this color pair. All right, moving on to some archetypes now, starting with those 5 enemy color pair, 2 color pairs I was talking about. We've got red-white cycling, we've got black-white humans / sacrifice, green-blue mutate, green-black reanimator, and blue-red spells. The first 3 that I talked about, those are kind of the big ones. The last 2, the green-black reanimator and blue-red spells. Green-black reanimator was more of a package than a whole deck, as far as I remember, and blue-red spells just like wasn't a great deck in general. It was a deck that came together once in a while, but not something that you did every draft, not something that I think the deck existed in every draft and every pod. So we'll get to those, but definitely going to focus mostly on red-white, black-white, and blue-green. Gonna start here with red-white. Red-white cycling. When I think of busted limited deck, like this is what comes to mind. Red-white cycling was really overpowered for a lot of different reasons. One of them being that its uncommon payoff, or one of the uncommon payoffs here, is Zenith Flare. It is just like really a messed up magic card, to be frank. So Zenith Flare is 2 red-white for an instant at an uncommon, and it deals X damage to any target, and you gain X life, where X is the number of cards with cycling in your graveyard. And at first read, this card might not seem that exciting. You're like, okay, how many cards with cycling are you actually going to get in your graveyard? But in these decks, you end up with a lot of cycling cards, or that's the goal anyways. You're really looking to fill your deck with as many cycling cards as you can. We're going to get to the payoffs in a second, but I really just want to call attention to the cycling cards in this set. And one of the things that made this deck busted is it just gets to steal a bunch of cards with cycling from all of the colors, right? This is red-white cycling, but the cycling in this set, the majority of it is colorless cycling. So you have something like Frostveil Ambush, 3 blue for an instant, tap up to 2 target creatures. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. This is before stun counters were a thing. And it has cycling for a single mana. So the idea with this deck was basically you'd get as many of these cards into your deck as possible, and then as many good payoffs as you could get. And you just cycle, triggering your payoffs that make tokens when you cycle, or deal your opponent damage when you cycle, or, you know, there's like a 3 mana enchantment or red that becomes a 5/4 trampler when you cycle. This deck plays out like basically no other limited deck we've seen before or since this. Like, there's very few decks that are like that. It feels like a constructed combo deck in a lot of ways. So when your deck is just full of these 1 mana cycling cards that, again, you get a density of them because you can steal them from other colors, not just the red-white ones. And you're dealing your opponent incidental damage with stuff like Durant Stinger, which is a 1 red 2/2. Then whenever you cycle a card, you deal 1 damage to each opponent. And this actually even has cycling itself, which is another layer of busted on this deck. A lot of the payoffs also have cycling. So it's not just like, oh, what do I draw my payoffs, not my enablers, or, you know, vice versa. They're so backwards compatible in a lot of cases. So anyways, you've got all these things that just deal incidental damage, help you attack, small creatures that get bonuses when you cycle cards, and then you really only have to get your opponent to like 10, and then you can Zenith Flare them out of the game. Just deal 10 to their face. And the really wild part about this is that since you're just cycling, you're digging through your deck so quickly, you find your Zenith Flare in such a large percentage of your games, right? So there's just like multiple layers of baffling about this deck, right? It's so consistent. It's got these wild payoffs, this 1 mana cycling as your enabler. It's very difficult to interact with. You really have to just interact with all your opponent's payoffs. Otherwise, you know, if you get in a few times, then Zenith Flare is just like, well, I'm at 12 and I'm just dead to a top deck Zenith Flare that they're gonna find pretty soon because so many of their cards just help them see new cards. One thing to note is there are also cards with cycling for 2 mana, so something like Raking Claws, 1 red for an instant. Target creature gains double strike until the end of turn, cycling for 2 colorless mana. The 2 mana cyclers are much worse than the 1 mana cyclers. Like, you really want to have as many of the 1 mana cyclers as you can. It's hard to overstate just how much better the 1 mana cyclers are. I mean, you know, there's half as much as 2 mana, right? That just comes up in so many situations where you're like, okay, plan my payoff, cycle for a single mana, do the thing. That's so much better than cycling for 2. And then speaking of those payoffs, so we're just going to go down a little bit of a list here. Aside from Zenith Flare, which is busted, honestly, close to as busted is Flourishing Fox, which is a single white mana for a 1/1 uncommon. And it has cycling for a single mana, of course, just like a lot of these payoffs. And whenever you cycle another card, put a +1/+1 counter on Flourishing Fox. So this thing just gets massive so quickly. It's gonna attack for 3 on turn 2 a lot of the time, and then 4, and then 5, and then, you know, as you're cycling things, you're finding more payoffs, and you've already presented this threat that's so difficult to deal with early on. So Flourishing Fox is right below Zenith Flare. Then we get to a few other uncommons here that are also pretty close. Just like Flourishing Fox is a little bit below Zenith Flare, I think these next 2 uncommons are just a little bit below Flourishing Fox. So we've got Valiant Rescuer. This is 1 and a white for a 3/1 human soldier. It's got cycling for 2 mana, so very underpowered here. The full 2 mana, not just 1. And it says whenever you cycle another card for the first time each turn, you make a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So that's just a fantastic card. It's the token factory. And then Reptilian Reflection, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment and an uncommon. Whenever you cycle a card, you can have Reptilian Reflection become a 4/5 dinosaur creature with trample and haste in addition to its other types until end of turn. So another card that just really puts the pressure on. You hit your opponent with this twice, and then you're like, okay, well, I'm in Zenith Flare range now. That's a big problem. It does not get blocked very easily, and it's pretty resilient to a lot of removal too, right? Only instant speed removal is going to kill this, and instant speed killing a 4 toughness creature removal is not something you come across all that often in this set. There is another uncommon payoff here, Savai Thunderman, and I think this one's actually quite a bit worse than the other one. So this is 1 and a red for a 3/2, and it says whenever you cycle a card, you may pay 2. When you do, the Thunderman deals 2 damage to target creature, and you gain 2 life. So it's a fine card. I'm never going to be sad to put this in my cycling deck, but it doesn't deal damage to the face. It can really mess up some board states, right? If your opponent's playing, it's actually really good in the cycling mirror to kill all of their payoffs, but sometimes your opponents are playing like big green decks or sacrifice decks that in effect it's not really going to do that much. You really just care about killing your opponents with these payoffs. So a fun card, once again, but not one I'm going to heavily prioritize. But then you move down to the common level, and even the common level stuff is pretty good. So we've got Snare Tactician. This is 2 and a white for a 2/3 human soldier. Whenever you cycle a card, tap target creature and opponent controls. Just a really difficult card to play with. It just means that your opponent has a really tough time blocking. They have a tough time racing. They have a tough time attacking you back. The person who controls Snare Tactician can kind of just go, all right, well, do I want to stop some damage from them? Do I want to use this aggressively? Just a very powerful card. And then Prickly Marmoset as another one. This is 2 and a red for a 2/3 first strike. Whenever you cycle a card, the Marmoset gets +2/+0 until end of turn. So just another card. Very difficult to deal with. You need a removal spell. Sometimes you just get one shot by this thing, or once again, get put to that 10 range where then Zenith Flare will then kill them. And then 2 more here. Dranistinger. That's the red 2/2 that I mentioned a second ago that deals a damage each time you cycle, and it's got cycling 1. And Drannith Healer, which isn't as good, but still a playable card. This is 1 and a white for a 2/2. It's the opposite. So whenever you cycle another card, you gain 1 life, and it has cycling for a single colorless mana. And while this doesn't kill them directly, it does actually buy you a lot of time, helps in the race, makes it so you have time to use your payoffs, find your Zenith Flare. So still a card I'm pretty happy to have, especially because it does have cycling 1 if you just want to cycle that to trigger your other payoffs. I'm really looking for, I would say, somewhere in the neighborhood of like 6 to 9 of these payoffs in my deck. I think a good way to figure out if this deck is open is figuring out, okay, on average, how many of these payoffs can I pick up? So if you're done pack 1 and you've got, 4 of them, okay, probably in pack 2 and pack 3, you're going to be able to keep drafting it. If you only picked up 1, like your first pick Zenith Flare and then didn't really see any, also didn't really see any 1 mana cyclers, that's probably a sign you probably have to do something else. And then so, if you're looking for that like 7, 9, 10 payoffs, the rest of the cards in your deck are, you really just want them to be cycling cards. You don't care about removal that much in these decks. Like, you're going to play some of the good stuff. It's just not a priority because so many of your creatures are already really good in combat. You don't need removal spells to force them in. And then something like Snare Tactician, that just kind of acts as your removal spell too. So you don't really want to be devoting slots in your deck to non-synergistic cards when you're the focused Zenith Flare, all-in, all-payoffs deck, because then you kind of just dilute your deck. And here's the final piece of the puzzle, is that your land counts in these decks should be fairly low, because since you're going to be cycling so much, you're going to be accruing a lot of lands generally, right? You don't want to be like, cycle. Oh, now I have 6 lands in hand. Oops. Usually in a really good cycling deck where you're just that 7 to 10 payoffs and the rest are cycling cards, you can go as low as like 12 lands, 13 lands. I think the average is usually going to be about 14, but you don't want to play more than 15 lands. 15 lands probably means something went wrong in your deck, right? Where you just didn't pick up enough cyclers. You have to play more than 15 lands. And that is kind of the deck's weakness, that if you don't end up with just the right number of things, you do end up flooding. You can have some awkwardness. So you're in a bad spot if you have to play more than 15 lands. Also, just like a quick gameplay tip, if you haven't played this deck before, you don't want to just cycle without payoffs in play. You want to save your cyclers so that when you get your stingers or your Repelling Reflection, or whatever payoff you have in play, you actually are getting the benefits of it, because, you still only have a limited number of triggers in your deck, only a limited number of times you can cycle. You don't want to just be cycling. You're going to do it if you need to find lands. Certainly a thing you're going to do, and you're going to have to find lands if you're playing 13 lands sometimes. You're going to go land, cycle, try to hit that second land. Sometimes it does happen. But don't think of this as like cycle. Like, I've got a Zenith Flare in my deck, I just want to find that. Again, you still have to deal that first 10-ish damage before you do get to cast that lethal Zenith Flare. Two more cards I want to call out here. Cathartic Reunion, which is 1 red for a sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this, you discard 2 cards, draw 3 cards. So this is a pretty good way to use all those excess lands that you're going to be accruing. In your best decks with just low land counts, you don't have to play this card. Like, basically, if you have not that many payoffs, but you picked up a lot of cyclers, which is often the way it goes, right? Usually, you're a bit low on the payoffs, not actually low on the cyclers. If that happens, your balance of what you picked up or needed to pick up in the draft was a little bit off, you can play it Cathartic Reunion. That's something that I definitely have done from time to time. And then, if you do miss some of those actual cycling payoffs, another kind of pseudo payoff you can play is Spell Eater Wolverine. This is 2 and a red for a 3/2, and it says it has double strike as long as there are 3 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your grave. And of course, a lot of these cycling cards are instant sorcery, so you can kind of count this as a secondary payoff. And it's actually a fine card, totally. It's not my first choice, but if you don't get to that like 7 payoff range, you can play this card. So yeah, that's the basics of the red-white cycling deck, the boogeyman of the format. It's a deck that is very powerful. I think goes down in history as it was a point of contention back in the day, where this was a great format, like I mentioned, really polarizing in some ways, where some people really loved it, but just that cycling deck was this dark spot of what otherwise was just like the shiny apple of a draft format. And some players were like, I can bear that because everything else in this format is great. Sure, you face the cycling deck sometimes, and that's annoying, but it's a price I'm willing to pay. There's some players who are like a little bit on the other side of the fence, where it's like, it's a great format, but I just can't stand facing the cycling deck. And then there's the real deranged people like myself, and I know Ben from Lords Limited like this, where I actually like playing the cycling deck and I like playing against it. I especially like cycling mirrors. I really enjoy that kind of like mechanical gameplay, just doing all the math and figuring out, especially in those mirrors, you get moments where you're like, okay, well, am I going to cycle on my turn or on my opponent's turn? Because on my turn, I get a trigger that can help me attack, but on their turn, I would get to tap down their stuff with my Snare Tacticians. Who's going to Zenith Flare first? Or if I blink first and I Zenith Flare, you Zenith Flare back in response, then I lose the game, so you're playing that little dance. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Not for everybody. I 100% would say that's not for everybody, but don't knock until you try it. That's all I'm going to say. Second archetype we're going to cover here is black-white humans / sacrifice, and this was actually a deck that I think took a while to catch on back in the day. Cycling and the mutate deck are kind of the loud decks of the format, but this deck's really good too. And like as busted as Zenith Flare is, actually right now, General's Enforcer, one of the black-white uncommons, is the top performing uncommon if you look on 17 lands. This is a card that people knew was good back in the day, but I don't think anybody had it as high as, in Zenith Flare tier. So General's Enforcer is black-white for a 2/3 human soldier at uncommon. It says legendary humans you control have indestructible, and also has an activated ability, 2 white-black. Exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, you make a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. So this card is really good on rate, just like, 2 mana, 2/3. The passive ability comes up sometimes, making your legends indestructible, but that activated ability is just great. Like, it's an army in a can. You get to really grind out the game, but not only do you get to grind out the game with this, you also get to manage graveyards, which matters for quite a few archetypes. There's the black-green reanimator deck that this kind of hoses. You can exile all the cycling cards from your opponent's graveyard, so their Zenith Flare turns off. There's a few reanimation things here and there. So this card not only is just good on base rate in a lot of ways, but does interact really well with the rest of the format. We've also got Dire Tactics as a great removal spell. This is white-black for an instant at uncommon. Exile target creature, and then if you don't control a human, you lose life equal to that creature's toughness, and in this deck, you're going to have a human a lot of the time, so it's just 2 mana exile something. And this deck sort of plays out like an aggro deck, sort of plays out like an attrition-y deck. It's one of those decks where you can have draws that really curve out and just kill your opponent, but then if you do get a little bit stopped in the early game, your opponent has some good interaction, you have ways to grind out the game. 2 uncommons here, if that kind of play into both of those things a little bit here. Bastion of Remembrance. This is 3 mana, 2 and a black for an enchantment at uncommon. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human soldier token, and then whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life, you gain a life. So very similar to Rakish Crew from Thunder Junction, but this cares about all your creatures, not just your outlaws, which is a really big deal. And then Sanctuary Lockdown. This is 2 and a white for an enchantment at uncommon. Humans you control get +1/+1, and it has an activated ability 2 plus tap 2 untapped humans you control to tap target creature and opponent control. So just pretty good card, like a glorious anthem that taps down your opponent's stuff. Looking at some commons that are supporting this deck, we've got 2 good token makers. Night Squad Commando is 2 black for a 2/3 human soldier, and if you attack this turn, you make a 1/1 white human creature soldier token when the center, so it's like a 3 mana 2/3 plus a 1/1 in a lot of cases. And then Day Squad Marshal, which is a very classic card. We've seen many versions of this before. 3 and a white for a 3/3 human soldier. When it enters the battlefield, you make a 1/1 white human creature soldier token. Both these cards are quite strong. And then there's the sacrificey side of things. Bushmeat Poacher. This card's really good. This is 3 and a black for a 2/4 human soldier. 1 tap, sacrifice another creature. You gain life equal to the sacrificed creature's toughness, and you draw a card. This thing in a lot of cases is just, you have to kill this on sight if you're the opponent. Otherwise, all your other removal just gets a lot worse. And also, they just start grinding through the game, drawing a bunch of cards, gaining a bunch of life. We've seen cards kind of like this in the past that sack things to draw cards, and usually they cost a lot more too. Usually it's like 3 mana to sacrifice to get your card. This is just 1, mind you. It's a little more expensive than those cards usually are, and it's 1 tap it, so you can't just keep doing it. But very strong card. The life gain definitely makes up for it, and it's a pretty decent body. 2/4 is not a bad body in this format. We also have Mutual Destruction as a way to use your tokens, as a removal spell for this deck. It's a single black mana for a sorcery. As initial cost to cast the spell, you sacrifice a creature to destroy target creature. And, little line of text here, this spell has flash as long as you control a permanent with flash. And there's like, a good handful of things with flash in this set. A card that is very near and dear to my heart is Whisper Squad. So this is a single black mana for a 1/1 human soldier. And it's got 1 and a black. Search your library for a card named Whisper Squad, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. This card's great. I say it's very near and dear to my heart because I feel like, information was a lot slower back in the day, and people didn't catch on to this card quite as quickly, and I was one of the first people to be like, I think this card's kind of good. So I kind of just became known as like the Whisper Squad guy. I have to this day, I have a Twitch emote that's Whisper Squad, really sweet. So this card, I think even on 2 copies, like, you should play it. Obviously, don't just play a 1 mana 1/1. But if you just have the first copy, having 2 is fine. If you draw 2 of them, a little unfortunate, okay. But, maybe you sack it to a Bushmeat Poacher or something. Maybe these even get pumped by a Sanctuary Lockdown. Like, even a 1 mana 1/1 human is not the absolute worst thing in the world, to be honest, if you do happen to draw your second one. But 3 is really great. 4 is where you start really getting to that sweet spot. I think 4 is the perfect number. When you go above 4, you get into awkward situations where you start to draw multiples in your opening hand. You really just want to draw 1 and then activate this as soon as you can just to get all of them out of your deck. But yeah, big fan of this card. It's one of the best ones in the deck. Also, other sacrifice fodder I want to call out here. Serrated Scorpion, single black mana for a 1/2. When it dies, it deals 2 damage to each opponent and you gain 2 life. This is a card that you're only really going to play in the most aggressive versions of this deck. Like, you're really low curve. If you're a little more grindy, you don't really want it. It doesn't generate any material or anything. Or there's like a black-red version of this deck that's pretty similar that will play this a little more often. That tends to be a bit more aggressive. You can also have like a small cycling package in this deck. And actually, this is true for basically every deck. And, I was talking about the crossover of archetypes and flexibility of your archetypes. And you can just have a Valiant Rescuer, which is the uncommon 3/1 that whenever you cycle, you make a token. And some Snare Tacticians have 5-6 cycling cards, and yeah, like, those are totally fine cards still. They're not going to be as busted as they are in the cycling deck, but they're humans for one. Valiant Rescuer makes a bunch of humans. Like, that's just great. So don't shy away from these. Don't be like, oh, these are for the cycling deck. No. They're totally good in this deck too. Nice little uncommon here. Call of the Death Dwellers. This is 2 and a black for a sorcery. Return up to 2 target creatures with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Put a Death Touch counter on either of them, and then a Menace counter on each of them. A little bit, similar to Lively Dirge in some ways, but this card, quite strong. You're often gonna reanimate like a 2-drop and a 1-drop. Sometimes you have an excellent 3-drop to go get. Sometimes you have like a First Striker, so giving it Death Touch is really nice. Nice little combos like that. And actually, you'll find that little First Strike, Death Touch, or just keywords that play together interaction quite a bit in this set. This was the first set with keyword counters, ways you can give keywords to other creatures that don't usually have them. And for example, there's a card called Porcuparrot, which is basically a pinger. It taps to deal damage to something. So if you give that Death Touch, well, that's great too. So you just look for those little combos. Often Death Touch and pinging, or Death Touch First Strike. Those are the most common ones, but there's some cool little interactions here and there. And then, I mentioned that this is sometimes a black-red deck too, but you're often going to splash a little bit in this deck. Maybe if your lane isn't super open, you're like, wow, I'm just the only person in black-white. You want to dip into some other colors just to get some power. One of the better things you can splash is Weaponize the Monsters. This is a single red mana for an enchantment at uncommon. Destruction. It has the ability to sack a creature, weaponize the monster, deals 2 damage to any target, and this just kills your opponent really quickly. Like, you've got 5 creatures on the board, you put your opponent to 10, well, they're just dead, as long as you have the mana and the time to sacrifice it. Really nice with Bastion of Remembrance, so you're like, everything you sack deals 3 damage instead, also gives you the time, keeps you alive, gives you a little bit of life, and then if you really want to go deep, there's Tentative Connection. This is an active treason effect, 3 and a red for a sorcery. It costs 3 less to cast if you control a creature with Menace, so again, that keyword's mattering here. And you gain control of target creature, untap that creature, it gains haste, so take that, sacrifice it to your weaponize the monster, sacrifice that to your mutual destruction, the bone splinters kind of effect, sacrifice it to your bushmeat poacher, gain some life. So yeah, I think this deck is great. I think, like I said, it was a little bit overlooked the first time around. I think there's a decent chance that it'll be a little bit underdrafted, considering this isn't, when people think of Ikoria, I don't really think they think black-white humans is like the deck. They do think mutate and cycling a little bit more. So, maybe you're lucky, maybe you just get all these pieces, and a good black-white deck can definitely compete with a good cycling deck. I really do believe that. All right, next up, we've got the Mutate deck, blue-green Mutate. And Mutate's a really fun deck. It's definitely a very Timmy deck where you get to make a bunch of triggers go in the stack and be like, oh, look how many things I'm doing. It's very fun. Like, even, I don't really consider myself that much of a Timmy player, but even I, enjoy getting a bunch of Auspicious Sterix triggers on the stack and just putting my whole deck onto my library. So it's for the dreamers for sure. Competitively, I don't think it's actually that strong. Like, inherently, it's just a little bit less robust than the other decks in the format. You're very much like Egg's Basket in a lot of cases. You're trying to build one big monster to really overwhelm your opponent. So let's get into it. First, let's start with the mechanic itself, Mutate. So Mutate is a ability you're going to find on creatures. It says, if you cast this spell for its Mutate cost, put it under or over target non-human creature you control. They mutate into the creature on top, plus all the abilities from under it. So a little bit weird, but first you need a host, right? You need a non-human creature. That's important, easy to forget. And then you, just in your first case here, let's say you mutate on a Migratory Greathorn. Okay, so Migratory Greathorn is a 4-mana, 3/4 in green, and it has a mutate cost of 2 in a green. And when this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tap. So let's just say you have a 1-mana 1/1, Almighty Brushwag, 1-mana 1/1 trample, and you on turn 3, you mutate the Greathorn onto the Brushwag. Well, you're going to put this on top of the Brushwag. Now your creature is a 3/4, and when this mutates, or kind of like an enter the battlefield effect attached to the Brushwag, you get to get the trigger. All right, so you get to get your basic land, and you go on from there. And then let's say you have another Migratory Greathorn in hand, and you mutate onto your mutate pile, right? You can think of this as like a mutate pile. Then what will happen is the Migratory Greathorn you just cast will trigger, but also the first Greathorn's trigger is going to trigger. So you're going to get 2 lands this time. And each time you start mutating onto this with other things, you're going to get each trigger that has come before it, basically, or each thing is mutated onto it. The power and toughnesses, they don't add. It's always just whatever the top thing is. So you're always going to want to choose the largest power and toughness. That's a pretty simple part of it. And mutates just like classically, there's so many weird rules interactions. Not too much that comes up in limited, to be honest, but it's just, you don't really see this anywhere else. Just some basic things here. If you kill a mutate creature, all the creatures go to the grave. If you bounce a mutate creature, all the creatures go back to your hand. Basically, if the mutate pile would go into some zone, all the cards in the pile go into that zone. Thankfully, if you go to mutate onto something and they kill the creature you're trying to mutate onto, you don't lose your mutate creature that you're casting. It just enters the battlefield as a creature. So you're good on that. Sort of like Bestow in some ways if you played with Bestow before. And one thing that's important when you're drafting this deck is you really want to make sure you've got enough cheap non-human enablers for this deck, because that can really be a problem. If you've got a Greathorn in your hand on turn 3 and you haven't played a 2-drop that you can mutate onto, your draw is going to be extremely clunky, and this deck already can be a little bit clunky. So ones to call out here at common, we've got Essence Symbiote. This is one of the best ones. It's 2 mana, 1 in a green for a 2/2, and whenever a creature you control mutates, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature, and you gain 2 life. Another little rules thing here, actually. +1/+1 counters play well with mutate creatures, right? Because you're going to have a base power and toughness, whatever the biggest thing in your mutate pile is. And then, you can grow your creatures from there with +1/+1 counters. We've also got Almighty Brushwag, which is a single green mana for a 1/1 trample. It's got an ability 3 in a green to give the Brushwag +3/+3 until end of turn. Polywog Symbiote, one of the better ones at uncommon here, 1 in a blue for a 1/3. Your mutates cost 1 less, though that counts both the mutate cost and the normal cost. And whenever you cast a creature spell, if it has mutate, you draw a card, then discard a card. Farfinder is a fine one. It costs 3 mana, and you really want your things you mutate onto to be like 1 or 2 mana so you can get the things going. But Farfinder's okay. It's 3 mana for a 1/1 Vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you go look through your library for a basic land, put it into your hand, then shuffle. Often these mutate decks are going to be splashing a decent amount. Like, it's a blue-green base, but there's mutate cards in all colors, mostly in blue-green. But you're going to find, like, oh, I really want this of this mutate card. It's really strong. There's a cycle of mythic mutate cards that are 3 colors. Although their mutate cost is 2 colors, it'll be like 2 hybrid Rakdos white-white. So it would either be 2 white-black or 2 red-white, you know, so it's definitely, they're more flexible, but these are cards that are very strong, and you're going to want to splash them, and you're going to find a lot of cards kind of like that through the set. Looking at some uncommons here, Parcel Beast. This is 4 mana, 2 green-blue for a 2/4. It's got mutate for green-blue, and the ability is 1 tap, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you can put it on the battlefield. If you don't put that card on the battlefield, put it into your hand. So you're drawing a card per turn. If it's land, you get to put it on the battlefield. This one's okay. It's kind of weird because it doesn't actually play the same way as basically all the other mutate cards, where it's just like, well, when you mutate this thing, you do a thing, and when you keep mutating, you get to do that thing over and over. But it is a solid card to kind of just like grind out the game. Some of the better ones here, Pouncing Shore Shark. This is 5 mana for a 4/3. It's got mutate for 4 mana, and it's got flash, and it says when this creature mutates, you may return target creature an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So just repeatable bounce spell, basically. Auspicious Sterix. This is 4 and a green for a 6/6 at uncommon. It's got mutate for 5 and a green. When this creature mutates, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile X permanent cards, where X is the number of times this creature is mutated. So this is, you know, this is for those people who really want to get the good brain juices going and be like, look how many triggers I made. This one really goes off, and you get to put those permanents on to the battlefield, which is really cool. Be careful though, because I have killed myself before with 2 Sterixes. You go really crazy. You actually get a lot of permanents, right? It just adds up very quickly, and it's easy to deck yourself with this card, because this is not a mate. You have to just reveal all the permanents you have put up on the battlefield. Archipelagor, another one of the great ones here. This is 5 blue-blue for a 7/7. Mutate for 5 and a blue. Whenever this creature mutates, tap up to X target creatures, where X is the number of times this creature mutated. Those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap step. So another one that really just scales with as much as you mutated, and it's just gigantic too, right? 7/7 is massive. So yeah, like I said, it's a cool deck. It's a fun deck. I remember when the format first came out, I was drafting these kind of decks a lot, and I had decent success with them. It was before everybody kind of figured out the format and figured out what cycling was the thing to do. But I think if you just keep in mind that, make sure you've got a lot of those cheap enablers. Like, I would be looking for 6 or 7 1 and 2 drop non-human creatures to be able to mutate onto early, and then make sure you've got, you know, somewhere like 6, 7 good mutate cards as your payoffs. It can work out, and you can definitely have some really explosive turns with this deck. And if you're enjoying the show so far, and you'd like to support what we do, go check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limited level ups. Bunch of rewards over there that we want to give back to you if you choose to support us. That Patreon is the #1 place you can go to support me or any of my content. It really does help the show keep on running. Also, there's a new set coming out in just a few weeks, Modern Horizons 3. It's going to be the main draft set of the summer, so always the best time to get on the Patreon, get access to those rewards. So yeah, go check it out if you're interested in supporting or getting those rewards. All right, next up we've got Black-Green Reanimator. This is a pretty cool deck. It's not a deck where the entire deck is themed around this one thing. It's a little bit more just like a, you know, black-green, attrition-y, and mid-range, what you kind of expect from black-green. I think actually black-green and OTJ is probably a really good comparison. But it does have a pretty sick combo, or just like set of combos, where you've got 2 reanimation spells and 2 gigantic things that are good for reanimating. So your reanimation spells are Back for More. You're familiar with that one if you've played Thunder Junction. This is 4 black-green instant. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. When you do, it fights one thing your opponent controls, and Unbreakable Bond as the other reanimation spell here. This is 5 mana, 4 and a black, sorcery. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it. So, you know, you can just reanimate whatever, any big creature. Something like a Honey Mammoth, which is a 6 mana, 6/6 that comes in, gains 4 life. That's just a pretty solid card. But the real combo is when you have something like Titanoth Rex or Void Beckoner. So these are both gigantic creatures. Titanoth Rex is a 9 mana, 7 green, 11/11 with trample. And the Void Beckoner is a 6 black, 8/8 death touch. But both these cards have cycling. Titanoth Rex has cycling for 1 and a green, and when you cycle it, you put a trample counter on target creature. And Void Beckoner has cycling for 2 and a black, and when you do, you put a death touch counter on target creature. So of course, you got the nice combo of discard these early, get them back with Back for or Unbreakable Bond. A lifelinking 11/11 Trampler will kill your opponent very, very quickly. I mean, lifelink doesn't play into that, but, you know, if you just get one attack, that gigantic swing, and they kill it, well, you still got a bunch of life out of the deal. Void Beckoner, kind of the same thing. It's a little bit less good because it doesn't kill them in 2 hits, but, this is a really effective thing. These are just pretty solid cards. Like, this is not a slow format, but you do get to the point where you hard cast these cards sometimes, especially if you have some mana production creatures, something like Skull Prophet, which is a black-green 3/1 and uncommon that you can tap it to add black or green, or tap it to mill 2 cards. There's also, just a bit of a general recursion theme and something like Boneyard Lurker. This is a 2 black-green 4/4 at uncommon. It's got mutate for 2 hybrid Golgari. And whenever this creature mutates, return target permanent from your graveyard to your hand. So yeah, it's just like, think of your classic mid-rangey black-green deck. Nothing too complicated, but you got that added spice of if you compare those reanimation spells with these giant monsters. All right, now that the last of our enemy color pairs here, blue-red. And like I mentioned at the top, this one doesn't come together as often. There's just not as many great cards to support this deck as there are for some of the other decks we talked about. There is a really excellent synergy at common, though. So we've got Forbidden Friendship, which is 1 and a red for a sorcery. Create a 1/1 red dinosaur creature token with haste and a 1/1 white human soldier creature token. And this card is just good, by the way. It's good in a lot of decks. Good in like the sacrifice decks we were talking about. You could play it in your cycling deck as like a medium filler card, but it's a pretty powerful card, right? 2 mana, make 2 tokens. One of them gets haste, and notably in the set, it makes a human and a non-human, which is very important for a card like Of One Mind. So it says 2 and a blue for a sorcery. It's just a divination, draw 2 cards, but it costs 2 less to cast if you control a human creature and a non-human creature. So these are like the commons for the deck. These are the 2. If you just had like 4 of these, 4 Forbidden Friendships and 4 Of One Minds, your deck would be quite strong. Because the 1 mana draw 2 is fundamentally broken, right? They wouldn't print that card at all, but you can get that when you have Forbidden Friendship. And of course, these are spells which support your spells payoffs, and the best spells payoff is Sprite Dragon. This is blue-red for a 1/1 flying haste at uncommon. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Sprite Dragon. There's also the Wolverine I mentioned earlier, the spell Wolverine, like the 3/2 red creature that gets double strike if you've got 3 spells in your grave. Red-blue can also be sort of a cycling deck too. You can use like the base red of the cycling cards with some of the blue spells that can sort of work as well. And so it's a deck that's a little bit more finicky. It's a deck that you're not going to draft as often, but I do really think if you've got like just these 3 cards, these are really the key. Forbidden Friendship is just a good card. Like, you can take this card early and maybe blue's open, maybe you get a bomb rare past you, maybe you get some of the good blue mutate cards, you can do that. Sprite Dragon also plays pretty well with mutate. Of course, I mentioned the +1/+1 counter synergies in there. So yeah, it's a cool deck, but I drafted Ikoria like 200 plus times when the set first came out. I think I probably drafted blue-red maybe like 5 or 6 of those times. And maybe I was just underrating the deck. Maybe it's just a deck that I should have gotten into more. But I guess my point is, you don't naturally find yourself in it unless you just first pick a Sprite Dragon, maybe get past them later and get these good commons. All right, now we're going to jump over to the allied color pairs here. So all of the allied color pairs, again, are not as supported as the enemy ones. There's just not as many cards. The decks aren't as good, to be honest. And they all key off a certain keyword. So black-red cares about menace. Blue-black cares about flash. Green-white cares about vigilance. Green-red cares about trample. Blue-white cares about flying. I think out of these decks, black-red is the one that comes together the most, and sometimes you lean into the menace stuff a little bit. So the uncommon here, Sonorous Hellbonder, is a 1 hybrid black-red, 2/2 menace that each creature you control with menace can't be blocked except by 3 or more creatures. So it doesn't quite make your creatures unblockable, but pretty close to that. This is an okay card. All of the uncommons that we're going to go through here are just okay. Like, they're kind of just fine. I think black-red is the one that comes together the most often because it does bleed into the white-black sacrifice stuff. You can just have an actual factual black-red steal and sack deck that actually works. But the reason that you're going to get into these decks is really the rares. Each of these decks has a specific rare, and they've juiced them. They really want to entice you to play these lesser strategies sometimes. So let's just go through those ones. So the black-red one is Labyrinth Raptor. It's black-red for a 2/2 menace. Whenever a creature you control with menace becomes blocked, defending player sacrifices a creature blocking it. Then has an ability black-red. Creatures you control with menace get +1/+0 until end of turn. So that was quite strong. Then blue-black has Slitherwisp. Really fun card. This is blue-black-black for a 3/2 flash. Whenever you cast another spell that has flash, draw a card and each opponent loses a life. So it really just sets you up for like this super flash game, never tap out. And something worth noting is that since these decks are kind kind of more niche, kind of more just like, okay, people don't really get into them. You sometimes do get past multiple copies of these cards. Not only are they narrow, but they're also gold cards, right? So I've had decks where I first pick a Slitherwisp out of a weak pack, and then I get past one in pack 2. And then you can really, really go deep. So that's, I think, the main way that you're really going to find yourself in these kind of decks. By the way, the uncommon for blue-black is Cunning Nightbonder. Hybrid blue-black for a 2/2 flash, and spells you cast with flash cost 1 less and can't be countered, which is minorly irrelevant because Essence Scatter is actually a common in the set. Green-white Vigilance has Frontland Felidar as the rare here. It's 2 green-white for a 3/5 Vigilance, and creatures you control with Vigilance have 1 tap target creature. Of course, counts the Felidar too, but all of your Vigilance creatures become tappers, and the uncommon's pretty decent too. Alert Heedbonder. This is 1 Hybrid Selesnya for a 2/4 Vigilance. At the beginning of your end step, you can gain 1 life for each creature you control with Vigilance. So this thing just really just comes up the ground, gains a bunch of life, gives you time for your Felidar to tap down things slowly, get in, peck in some damage each turn. It's definitely a slower green-white deck. It's not like a aggro beat them down green-white deck very often, although sometimes that happens. There's like a 2-mana 1/4 Vigilance at common, and there's another common, it's a 1-mana aura that gives your creature a +1/+1, and then it deals damage equal to its toughness rather than its power. So, you know, you would have some fast starts with that. But generally, I think you want to just lead with green-white. You want to lead a little bit more into take things slow, use the Felidar to take over the game. Green-red has a trample archetype, so Quartzwood Crasher is the rare. This is 2 red-red-green for a 6/6 trample. And whenever 1 or more creatures you control with trample deals combat damage to a player, you make an XX green dinosaur beast creature token with trample, where X is the amount of damage those creatures dealt to that player. And then the uncommon here, not a very good one, honestly. Proud Wildbonder. This is 2 Gruul Hybrid for a 4/3 trample. Creatures you control with trample you may have this creature assign combat damage as though it weren't blocked. So call back to the really, really old version of what trample used to be back in the 90s, basically. There's a bunch of cards with this kind of ability. Thornwood Elemental is an example. So this is more, you know, Quartzwood Crasher. I found you kind of splash this card more often than not. It just does the thing on its own. You don't need other creatures to trample. I think the only time I drafted this deck back in the day was like the actual first draft I ever did, and it was like an okay deck. It wasn't anything special. But I think this is one that you're just not going to want to be leaning into the theme too much. And I think that's true for the last one here too, which is Blue-White Flyers. The uncommon Jubilant Skybinder is 1 Azorius Hybrid for a 2/2 flyer. And it says creatures you control with flying have spells your opponents cast that target the spell costs 2 more to cast. So sort of like Ward, but just for spells. And it's just like a not an amazing card. The rare is pretty good. Skycat Sovereign. It says blue-white for a 1/1 flying creature. It gets +1/+1 for each creature you control with flying, and it has an ability 2 white-blue to make a 1/1 flying creature token. So definitely a strong card, but I think just like the Crasher, it's a card you splash a little more often than actually play this deck. Like, this is another deck I think I only drafted once the entire time I played this set the first time around, and that was more just like, well, it's draft 175. Let's just do an interesting thing kind of thing rather than I think it's a good thing. There's actually just not that much flying in the set, to be honest. So this is more just like a 1-card card that's just going to pump itself and make a bunch of tokens. A strong card, once again, the Skycat Sovereign, but don't lean into it. All right, then lastly here, going to talk about the Companions. So the Companions are another thing that adds just another layer of complexity, of depth, just interesting things to do in this format. We played with them pretty recently if you played with March of the Machine, but this is the format where they were most supported. I mean, it's the format they first came from, so of course it makes sense. But there are more commons that just like, oh, that works well with a Lurrus deck, or, you know, oh man, that uncommon, like, Weaponize the Monsters is really good in my Obosh deck, for example. So you're gonna find these little synergies here and there. They've definitely got a huge nerf from the new companion rule where you have to pay 3 to put them in your hand. Back in the day, like, these were just busted. You would take these, it's no question, use your companion. Most of these, it was pretty easy to do so. I think now there's a cost associated with them. They're not just slam dunks. There are a few that are still very, very good. I'm going to go through a rough little power ranking here quickly. But if you're listening to or reading any content from 2020, people will talk these up really, really, really highly. And I think just like temper your expectations, because that nerf was a real nerf. So just let's go through some of them quickly. I'm not going to go through exactly how you want to build them. There's a lot of content out there to do that. In fact, I'm going to post my draft guide that I wrote for this set. It's like a 10,000 word draft guide I wrote for Draft Sim back in the day. You know, we kind of just scratched the surface in today's video, but if you really are like, hey, I really like this format, I want to know everything about it, go check that out. Like I said, I'll put it in the YouTube description, also the podcast feed. Surely just like a manifesto on Ikoria. But yeah, we'll go through a little bit of a power ranking here. So I do still think Lurrus of the Dream Den is great. I think this card is really strong. The 3-mana tax that you have to pay you don't feel it as much because Lurrus is more of a grindy card. You play it after the dust is settled. You're not just want to, you also want to slam this on turn 3. You don't mind paying 6 mana for this. So Lurrus is the one hybrid Orzhov 3/2 lifelink that the companion requirement is each permanent in your starting deck has mana value 2 or less. And then once during each of your turns, you can cast a permanent spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard. And Lurrus is really one of the ones I think of when I think, oh, there's like a lot of little small cards in here that work well with Lurrus. So there's a 2 mana artifact called Sleeper Dart that comes in, draws a card. You can tap sack it to make something not on tap. So that's just every single turn, you're drawing a card. There's a card called Springjaw Trap, which is like a single mana artifact with flash. Pay 5, deal 5 to something, so it's just a repeatable removal spell. And of course, plays well in the black-white sacrifice deck. You're just going to have a lot of small creatures. So Lurrus is the one I think you should go for. This might actually be the best card in the set when you get a good Lurrus deck. And again, the companion attacks, I think, affects Lurrus the least out of all these companions. Then we've got Lutri, the Spell Chaser, which is the one Is it hybrid 3/2 flash. The companion requirement is each non-land card in your starting deck has a different name, and then when Lutri enters the battlefield, if you cast it, copy target instant or sorcery spell you control. So it's tough. Like, a lot of the time you do end up in a spot where you've got multiples of good cards and you can't just play Lutri, but you're willing to cut one copy of additional good cards so you can companion Lutri. And that's always the question you're asking yourself with these companions. I don't really think it's like a first pick these and always go for it. I think you want to really, if you're really doing it optimally, you're balancing what you see throughout the draft. You're weighing, is companioning worth me giving up 2 cards, 3 cards? I think a general rule of thumb is if you have to give up 2 cards, 2 good cards, then it's worth companioning. A third one, that's kind of pushing it. But yeah, Lutri is strong. And then we have 2 similar ones that, Gyruda and Obosh. Gyruda cares about even mana cost. You need to have only an even mana cost, and Obosh needs to have only odd mana cost. So Gyruda is a 6 mana for Dimir 6/6 that when it enters the battlefield, each player mills 4 cards, and you can put a creature card with mana even value from among them onto the battlefield under your control. So just a really good card. And another thing to note about all these companions, most of these are just good cards. Like, you can just put them in your deck. Don't feel compelled to companion them. It's great if you could do it, but just don't give up too much to do so, because if you just put Gyruda in any black deck, any blue deck, it's going to be great. Obosh is, it's opposite here. It's 3 Rakdos hybrid for a 3/5. And the companion requirement is all your things have odd mana costs. And the ability is, if a source you control with an odd mana value would deal damage to a permanent or a player, it deals double that damage to a permanent or a player instead. So really, this is a 6/5 that doubles all the damage for all your cards if you're building around the requirement. Then we've got Gigantha. And Gigantha is a little bit like Lutri. So this is a 4/1 rule hybrid for a 5/5. And the companion requirement is no card in your starting deck has more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost. So you can't have a red card or a black card. And it also has the ability, which comes up sometimes but not often. Usually it's just, there's a 5 mana 5/5. Tap, add Wooburg mana, but this mana can't be spent to cast generic mana cost. So sort of like Lutri, I would ask myself, how many cards am I giving up? Am I giving up 1 card that's like a good double-costed rare? Okay, probably worth playing Gigantha, worth having that 8th card. If you're giving up 2 or 3, and I'd be actually a little bit less impressed with Gigantha than Lutri. I think Lutri is a little bit better. If you're giving up 2 cards, of course it depends on what the quality of the cards are, but I would definitely be hesitant. I will also say I'm less of a companion lover than some people. Compare me to Ethan Sachs, Lord Tupperware from Lords Unlimited. Like, Ethan's all about companions. I'm a little more tepid on them. You might fall somewhere in between us on that spectrum, but everything I'm saying here, view that under the lens of I'm not one to just companion at all costs. I'm a little more picky about the cards that I play. And so I think those are the important ones to go over. I'm actually not going to go over the last 5 companions here. Zerta, Karuga, Omori, Yorion, and Kahira. I think they all have a companion requirement that's a little too tough, or the cards just aren't that strong. Again, a lot of these are just good cards. In fact, all those I just mentioned, you should just still play them. Like, I think the majority of these cards, there's nothing wrong with them. But the companion costs, like Yorion making you play 60 cards, that's kind of tough. Umori making you have all creatures in your deck. Karuga not letting you play 1 and 2 drops. Like, just really hard to build around. Not impossible, and if you're up for the challenge, great, it's really cool. But just as far as winning goes, I think the other 5 we talked about, those are the ones you want to lean into. All right, and that's going to do it. Thank you so much for watching and listening. This really is just scratching the surface of Ikoria, kind of just preparing people who want a refresher or haven't played the set before. Like I mentioned, I'm going to post the draft guide I wrote for Ikoria down below. And I'll also post my 17 lands link as well. I didn't have a chance to go over every single card, of course. So if you just want a quick look up of like, okay, how good is this card? Go check that out. We still have one more Thunder Junction episode in the mix coming a little bit later this week. Gonna be the Thunder Junction State of the Format Address episode now that we're 5 weeks in. So a little bit more check-in. But Modern Horizons 3 is coming up quickly. Like, spoiler season's almost done. We almost got a new draft set on the horizon. Looking forward to it. Thanks for listening and watching, everybody. We'll see you next time.